Hi, everybody. Give it a minute here and wait for everybody to join us. If you're having a good Tuesday so far, and welcome to today's Torah class. We're dedicating the class to the memory of Reb Joel Levine, who passed away last week. And we pray that his neshama, his soul, be a blessing to all of us. So here we are, Parshat Lech Lecha, and it's a powerful portion that talks to the journeys and the ways we all find ourselves in Abraham's story of discovering God, but ultimately in discovering himself. And so it's a perfect opportunity to utilize that energy of searching. That's our energy as well, of finding what we need to find. So we can do that together, and we'll also dedicate it to the memory of Reb Joel. I shared this with his family, and I'll share it with you. Reb Joel Levine was a special person. For those of you who were fortunate enough to know him and to learn from him and to see him in action. He was filled with life and filled with a love of Judaism and a love of Torah. And this summer, he shared something beautiful with me. It wasn't what he had shared, it's how he shared it. When he was excited about something that he had studied, for example, he was on fire. And so we were having our Shabbat outdoor minyan, and he came to shul with such a passion and an energy, telling me about a Gemara tractate of Talmud that he was studying in the end of Baba Batra, and that it's a life-changing text and a life-changing idea. And he says, when you get a chance, please study it. And I said, Reb Joel, I'm so excited about the opportunity to study that piece of Talmud, and when I get to it, I will. And one thing led to another, and I didn't get a chance to study it. And after he passed away, I felt bad about that. I felt like I missed an opportunity to engage with him on something that he was passionate about. And so this past Saturday night before his funeral, I went to my bookshelf and I pulled out the Baba Batra, and I studied it, and I opened it and started to look at it, and I was blown away. And I realized that this was a prime example of the kind of synchronicity of the universe, of the way things are meant to happen, not before, not after, but only when they're meant to happen. And I felt like I was absolutely meant to read this now. And I'm going to share that text with you in his memory. It's a beautiful and quintessentially Jewish approach to grief and mourning. And I think on a broad level, it's a teaching about challenge, about difficult times, and the way to approach difficult and challenging moments. What is the protocol of living one's life? It addresses the question of how do we conduct ourselves and our lives in the aftermath of grief or sadness or trauma, with a uniquely Jewish perspective. So I'm going to share the text with you, and we can study it together. Try to make it a little bigger for you. So once again, it's from Baba Batra, and the Mishna kind of sets the tone. And this is not the primary text that I want to address today, but I believe it speaks to the entire conversation. The Mishna says, and we're just going to focus in this text on one line: one may not form an empty space beneath the public domain by digging pits, ditches, or caves. And obviously, it's speaking to the question of creating a public menace, creating a dangerous scenario for somebody who's walking through a public thoroughfare, and the fact that you have a liability to be aware of people's safety and act accordingly. And so I want to choose today to look at it a little deeper on a more existential level. The Hebrew word halal, emptiness, void, is a very multifaceted word. It also refers to death, or a dead person, a person who has passed away. And I think you can read this as an existential statement. In osen halal tachas reshus harabim. The passing away of a person has to be done, has to happen in such a way so as not to leave a damaging emptiness in its wake. Well, how does that work exactly? We can't exactly orchestrate our passing in such a way so as to avoid the passerbys, in this case, the people in our world, from falling into that and being damaged. And especially if a person passes away suddenly. And so I think that the way a person lives their life overall is that precaution, and does set the tone for the way that we grieve and mourn the person. And to the extent that the person lived their life in a way of positivity and putting forth good energy, that minimizes and actually helps, is a source of comfort to those mourning that loss. And so with that introduction, I want to go to the actual text, which is a page later in the Talmud, and suggest that on a certain level, Reb Joel shared this text with me, and I was only meant to read it after he passed away, and this is kind of a metaphysical musing of mine, but it seems as if this was a tool that he was asking me to convey to his family and to all those that loved him, that would cushion his passing, that would cushion the blow. And I felt it was like a micro prophecy, a foreseeing of something I don't believe Joel knew or realized consciously, that he would pass away so soon after he shared this with me. But on a neshama level, on a spiritual soul level, I think he might have, and it's a powerful way of addressing that, the difficulties of resuming and carrying on with life in the aftermath of tragedy and loss and grief and trauma. So let's read this small piece of Talmud. Tanu Rabbanim. When the sages taught in the Baraita, Kishacharav Habayas, Bishnia, when the temple, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, was destroyed a second time. So there was this phenomenon. There was an increase in prushim, ascetics. What is an ascetic? Ascetic is someone who wants to magnify a certain grief even more than the grief itself, to broaden it and to withhold from oneself anything that can be a source of pleasure and satisfaction and joy, so as to fully mourn. And so these ascetics, these prushim, didn't eat meat and they didn't drink wine. And it was a spiritual practice. Rabbi Yeshua joined them to discuss their practice, and he challenged them. He says to them, Amr lahem, Bni, mipnei ma iatem echlin bas ve'atem sheisen yayin. Why aren't you eating meat and drinking wine? Amr lahem, they said to him, Nechel basar, in a question mark there. Nechel basar shemimenu makrivim al gavim mizbeach. Should we eat meat from which offerings are sacrificed upon the altar, and now the altar has ceased to exist? Nishta yayin sheminachasav sheminachasam sheminasken al gabe mizbeach ba'ashram batal. Should we drink wine which is poured as a libation upon the altar that has now ceased to exist? So, as you see, it was a full-on a spiritual practice meant to experience in your own body, in your own experience, the pain of loss of the temple, which was a horrible loss, and left an enormous halal, as does the passing of a loved one whose death leaves a crater-like void that is the existential similarity of the loss of the temple. For a family, the loss of a father is like losing a Beit HaMikdash. And in the eyes of these Prushim, the way to mark that was through inflicting suffering voluntarily upon oneself. And Rabbi Yeshua was not having it. He wasn't buying it. He's saying this is not a Jewish approach to mourning, to grief. Here's a continuation of that. Amar Lahem. So Rabbi Yeshua said to them, if so, he challenged them in their approach itself. If so, we will not eat bread either, since the meal offerings that were offered upon the altar have ceased. So they replied, you're correct. It is possible to subsist with produce, with fruits. Efsher beperis. So he said to them, no, I don't know. We shouldn't eat produce either, since the bringing of the first fruits have ceased. So they replied, Rabbi Yeshua, you're correct. We'll no longer eat the produce of the 7 species from which the first fruits were bought, as it is possible to subsist with other produce. So he said, wait a second, I'm not done. If so, we will not drink water, since the water libation has ceased. They were silent, as they realized that they could not survive without water. So what do we see here? We see here that he was getting into a dialogue with them on the technical aspect of it, but the underlying thrust of his approach was that it's not a tribute to the memory of a loved one to deepen one's misery as a homage to their life. In many ways, it's the exact opposite. The Rebbe, when the Rebbetzin passed away, everyone was coming to him and offering their condolences, and the Rebbe turned the entire process of the mourning period on its head by reframing every conversation, every interaction as a call to action in memory of the Rebbe. And the mantra that he kept on repeating was, paraphrasing the Jewish statement of V'chai Bahem with regards to the mitzvot, that V'chai Bahem, you have to live through them. That Judaism is set up, is the infrastructure of Judaism is established in such a way as to require us to fully live within that framework and not abstain from the basics of life as a spiritual practice, because in doing so, we deprive God and the universe of a particular energy that comes about only through a positive and mindful and prayerful interaction with the world around us, that doesn't push the world away, but rather brings it close and sublimates it. And so whether we're dealing with a deep sadness and a grief or a worldview of spirituality, the more all-encompassing that world becomes, the more commensurate it is with the basic worldview of Judaism, which is to lift up the world around us, not to escape the world. And so in that spirit, I believe Reb Joel was conveying that message, not just to comfort his family and loved ones, but as a summarizing of what he stood for, that is a quintessentially Jewish and mystical approach to how to live life. And so in that spirit, I want to share a story with you. It's a story of Rabbi Eli Melech of Lech and his brother, Reb Zusha. And they were, especially Reb Zusha, was known as an itinerant preacher who roamed the countryside and lifted up people's spirits wherever he was. And this story takes us to a time that, for whatever reason it was, it didn't take much for Jews to be thrown into jail by the local nobility for spurious accusations that were baseless and anti-Semitic at their core. And so, without getting into the depth of how it happened, these two brothers found themselves in a prison cell together with hardened criminals. And it was time to pray mincha. And there was a bucket in the corner of the cell filled with refuse. And Rabbi Elimelech began to cry. And his brother says, Reb Zusha says, "Why are you crying?" And so he responds to him, he says, the halacha, the Jewish law, forbids us from praying in the presence of a bucket of refuse. And you can't pray near a bathroom. And this whole cell is like a bathroom. And so Reb Zusha turns to his brother and he says to him, "I don't get it." He says, "You should be dancing and celebrating." He says, "What do you mean?" He says, "Crying is inappropriate over here because the fact that you can't pray mincha is supplemented and replaced by the opportunity to fulfill another precept." He says, "Which precept is that? Which mitzvah is that?" He says, "It's the mitzvah of not praying next to a toilet." And that's as much of a manifestation of God's will, the not praying in this moment, as praying would be. And so Reb Elimelech thought about it for a moment, and he said, I hear you. And he stopped crying, and they both started to dance, a boisterous, joyful, heartfelt Hasidic dance. And Hasidic dancing is renowned and well known for the way it uplifts the totality of the person, of the human. And so they were having this beautiful dance, and the guards came and were asking, what is this ruckus all about? Says, so the bewildered criminal said, well, it looks like the Jews are dancing because they're happy that there's a toilet in the middle of the cell. And one guard says to another, says, they're celebrating that. We'll teach them. We'll show them. And immediately, what do? They remove the offensive, foul-smelling bucket from the prison cell. At which point, of course, both Reb Elimelech and Reb Zusha commenced praying mincha. And so I guess this is a Hasidic equivalent of a lean in to what is kind of moment of just being with whatever is, with whatever we are experiencing at the moment, to work with it and to remain where we are, remain in that situation and interact with it compassionately, with no judgment, with no storyline that either ignores that reality or is saddened by it. Just work with it, and the inner reality of that moment will surface, and the outer layer, which presents as an obstacle, will start to fade with that warmth. Just like the rays of the sun cause a beautiful flower to come out from its concealment, and our positive energy towards any given situation, as opposed to deepening the storyline like the sages were doing, is more of Rabbi Yehoshua approach of being with it and not imposing and inflicting more grief on us, but just sit with it and with compassion. And Abraham did the same thing in this week's portion. We can end off with that. Says that Vayer Hashem al Avram, God appeared to Abraham, Vayomer, and he said to him, L'zaracha attain et haaretz hazot. To your ancestors, to your descendants, I will give this land. Vayiven sham mizbeach. And he built there an altar. Now here's the interesting thing about that passage. Those three words, Vayiven sham mizbeach. And he built there an altar. Raises an interesting question. I believe Rashi addresses it. It doesn't say that he offered anything on the altar. It just says he built it. And why doesn't it tell us what he did with the altar, how he And in many ways, this is a Rabbi Yehoshua approach, a leaning in approach that Abraham really needed to channel. Abraham was at a crossroads. He had spent his entire lifetime arguing for the existence of a God whose existence he couldn't prove. And he was fighting against the currents. He was fighting a losing battle. He was a lone voice in a sea and a world of idolatrous thinking. And it was only when he was 75 years old that God appeared to him. And so it was with that uncertainty that he built this altar. He wandered because God told him to wander, and God didn't give him a GPS and a map and say, I want you to go from point A to point B and stop there. God was looking for Abraham to trust his instinctive spiritual inner compass that would recognize intuitively, would recognize the holiness of the land of Canaan and stop there. And that's exactly what happened, but there was no real confirmation. But he stopped there and he built his altar because he just knew that this was the place. And he didn't offer anything because he had nothing to offer, because he was still in that uncertainty, which explains one of the more moving interpretations of Lecha means that he go towards your solitude, deepen your solitude. He was filled in his quest for a discovery of faith and discovery of God. He led a very lonely life, a life of solitude, of existential loneliness, where he had separated himself from society, but he did not yet have the camaraderie and the companionship of the God whose presence he was teaching, which was falling on deaf ears, and a God who had not yet given him the confirmation that he so yearned for. And that's where he is at this moment. So one of the beautiful interpretations is that Vayiven Sham Mizbeach, he built the altar just with his faith and with just being an instinct, and only then at that moment Hashem nira elav, God ultimately did appear to him and gave him that confirmation, that validation, and ultimately that companionship, and cured his existential loneliness. So I want to thank you for joining me, and I am thankful to Reb Joel for sharing this wisdom, this idea with us, and giving me the opportunity to share it with you as well. And I want to bless you and myself that we step onto the path of our journeys with hope and with confidence and with optimism where we know that whatever path we take, if we do so with faithfulness and joy and love and hope, then it's like Abraham. We know instinctively that it's our path, that it's right for us, and it'll lead us to exactly wherever it is that we're meant to go. Thank you for joining, and I wish you a great day. Red Joel. Thank you.